And I spent my semester building a Flash application to educate people on young Earth creationism, because at the time I was utterly fascinated by the young Earth creation arguments. But all of my sources were Protestant, and ultimately I felt there was weakness because of the Protestant theology behind it. And lo and behold, here is a Kolbe Center, praise be to God, and Hugh Owen joins us from the Kolbe Center, Catholic, who has been spending a great amount of time trying to educate the world in creation versus evolution. Good morning to you, Hugh Owen.
Good morning. Christ is risen.
Truly, he is risen. Praise be to God. We're glad for your time today. Thank you for being here. Young Earth creationism, I think, is a very fascinating subject, and I would hazard a guess that 99% of our audience has probably never even considered the arguments, have no idea what this would mean or why anybody would believe it, because all they've ever been told is that the world evolved arbitrarily over billions of years. Pretty much, if I had to sum it down to one argument, that's probably what they've ever been told. So how about we start with, what is young Earth creationism, and why would we ever entertain such an idea? Hugh Owen, Kolbe Center.
Certainly. So the first thing we should establish is that we don't really like the term young Earth, YEC. We prefer TAC, True Age Catholics, because one of the things that our fathers in the faith understood very well is that there's only one way to know with certainty where we're located in space and time, and that is from the one who is outside of space and time, our Heavenly Father. And I'm sure there are a lot of G.K. Chesterton fans in the audience, and they're familiar with his famous phrase, democracy of the dead. And the fact of the matter is, if we could take a vote among all the Catholics from the beginning of the church, including all of the fathers and doctors of the church, we would find that they're overwhelmingly, really unanimously, true age Catholics who believed that the sacred history of Genesis gave us inerrant information directly from God that allows us to know exactly how we're oriented in time and space. Now, there are a lot of Catholic intellectuals today who go around telling young people that Catholics never took Genesis literally. It was just some Protestant fundamentalists in the 19th century who started getting worked up about that. Nothing could be farther from the truth. If you actually go back and read what the apostles, the fathers, and the doctors of the church taught, what they wrote about the creation of the world and the early history of the world, every single one of them believed that Genesis is a sacred history. You read St. Augustine, the one who's always being trotted out and pressed into service as some kind of proto-theistic evolutionist. And he says very plainly in his work, The Literal Interpretation of Genesis, that Genesis is not poetry, it's not allegory, it's history, just as the Book of Chronicles. So the fact of the matter is that every one of the fathers and doctors of the church would have shed his or her last drop of blood for the literal historical truth of the sacred history of Genesis. And that includes the little flower Saint Therese of Lisieux, who at the very end of the 19th century was being taught the same thing that the fathers and doctors had believed from the beginning, that Genesis is a true history of how God created the world and of the early history of the world, and that we are to take it at face value. The only point on which St. Augustine differed from the other fathers in that respect was with regard to the meaning of day in Genesis 1. But the reason that St. Augustine did not follow the overwhelming majority of the fathers and doctors in understanding day or yom, ds, in Genesis 1 to be the 24-hour day is that he had to rely on a very imperfect Latin translation of the Hebrew text of Genesis, the Vetus Latina. Had he been working with the Vulgate of St. Jerome, he would not have found any contradiction between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, when the days of Genesis 1 are taken as literal 24-hour days.
Mr. Owen, let's explore that a little bit here. You know, there are some bishops who even say that Genesis is heroic poetry, I think is the quote. But it doesn't square, really. And there's, on the other hand, some Catholics who will say that you can interpret evolution, the evolutionary formation of our the creatures and us, in a way that squares God at the center of that. What would you say to that? I think that's called theistic evolution.
I think that we need to understand why so many Catholics now are waking up to the reality that theistic evolution simply does not make sense theologically, philosophically, or in terms of the natural sciences. And this is because many Catholics look at the situation in the world over the last 2 years, and they see things that are totally absurd. They see charlatans like Tony Fauci using pseudoscience to tell successors of the apostles when they can open the churches of God, when they can administer the sacraments of God, how they can administer the sacraments of God. And all of this is in the name of their pseudoscience. Millions of Catholics are realizing this is totally disordered. But many want to go deeper. They want to understand, how did we get to the point where a charlatan like Dr. Tony Fauci and his associates can dictate to successors of the apostles how they will administer the sacred mysteries? And what people are realizing is it all goes back to Genesis. The overthrow of the traditional understanding of Genesis is what laid the foundation for the chaos that we are experiencing now, because it was through a process of deceit and deception that leading evolutionists like Ernst Haeckel and Sir Julian Huxley were able to deceive the overwhelming majority of the Catholic intellectuals at the beginning of the 20th century into believing that there was so much sound scientific evidence for the molecules to man evolution hypothesis that they simply had to reconcile evolution with the Catholic faith. And that in spite of the fact that the teaching authority at that time had categorically rejected this challenge against the traditional reading of Genesis. And so what we are able to show people, especially through our DVD series, Foundations Restored, and anybody can go and watch the first 2 episodes gratis at the website www.foundationsrestored.com, recommended by many bishops and outstanding priests and Catholic intellectuals from all over the world, www.foundationsrestored.com.
I meant to ask you this in the first segment. I wanted to get to this sooner in our conversation, but just how old do you say creation is versus what we're kind of taught billions of years? And it's always a nebulous number, right? It's just, they throw them out like it, as you know, it's so impressive, but golly gee whiz, billions and billions of years, this feels sort of gray and nebulous. What say you? How old do you think the creation is?
Well, the first thing we need to establish is that it's not important what I think or what any human being thinks. What's important is, what did God reveal? Because when he created the world, there were no human witnesses and the natural order hadn't been established. So there's only one way that anybody can know the true age of the universe, and that is from God's revelation. Now, all the fathers and doctors of the church, without exception, held that God revealed in the sacred history of Genesis information, especially in the genealogies, that allows us to determine the approximate age of the universe. And basically, in the entire Catholic tradition, you have 2 choices. You have the chronology that's derived from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which gives you approximately 7,500 years from creation until now, or 5,200 to 5,500 years from creation to the birth of Christ. And then you have the chronology that's derived from the Masoretic text, the Hebrew Masoretic text of the Old Testament, which is the one that St. Jerome follows in the Vulgate, and that gives you 4,000 years from creation to the birth of Christ. Now, we've all been brought up to believe that the billions of years are a scientific fact that only a fool would deny. But the reality is, all the so-called evidences for millions and billions of years are based on a false premise. And that premise is the premise of René Descartes and Immanuel Kant and the Enlightenment so-called philosophers, who completely rejected the traditional Catholic way of understanding the past, and who assumed without any proof whatsoever that the same natural processes, the same material processes that are going on now have been going on from the very beginning of the universe, and that therefore we can look at the universe as it is now and extrapolate all the way back to the beginning to explain how everything came to be. Well, as a matter of fact, we can't, because all the fathers and doctors of the church believed and taught the truth, that the whole work of creation was supernatural. And it was only when God finished creating the whole work of creation for us in our first parents that the whole work of creation was finished, and God rested from creating new kinds of creatures. And that's when the natural order of things began. So it doesn't matter how smart we are, it doesn't matter how good our technology is, we cannot study the universe as it is now and extrapolate all the way back to the beginning to explain how everything came to be.
Let me, because of time, because we're going to run out of time super fast here, and I want to get to some good meat here on the bone. Let's talk about your, give me the brief, the bullet points of some of the best evidences that we can look at from a scientific perspective on the Earth not being as old as we were taught, but possibly younger.
Certainly, there's so much, but let me take one of the great icons of evolution, the dinosaurs. Young people are relentlessly bombarded with propaganda that dinosaurs became extinct 65 million years ago. And yet on our website, in our DVD series, which you can see at www.foundationsrestored.com, we provide the overwhelming evidence published in peer-reviewed scientific journals all over the world that dinosaurs and humans have always lived together on Earth. And that and this evidence includes, for example, the discovery of soft tissue, intact proteins, red blood cells, intact strands of DNA, and carbon-14 in dinosaur bones. Now, carbon-14 has a half-life of 5,730 years. If the evolution myth were true, there shouldn't be one single atom of carbon-14 left in any dinosaur bone on the face of the Earth or in the Earth. And yet our scientists have proven by excavating or collecting dinosaur bones from all over the Earth that when these dinosaur bones are sent to world-class laboratories that have an accelerated mass spectrometer that can count the number of carbon-14 and carbon-12 atoms in the sample, every single one of those dinosaur bones contains substantial amounts of carbon-14, which proves that these dinosaurs lived thousands of years ago, not millions of years ago. And the interesting thing is, these dinosaur graveyards where these dinosaur bones have mostly been taken from, they are usually a jumbled assortment of disarticulated bones of land-dwelling dinosaurs together with ocean-dwelling creatures. And these are dinosaur graveyards that are hundreds and hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean. How do we explain that? Well, the most logical explanation is that they were buried in the global flood. But when you go back and study the history of how pseudoscience overturned the traditional reading of Genesis, their first line of attack was geology trying to discredit the evidence for a global flood. In reality, as we prove in our materials, geology makes much more sense in terms of a global flood in the time of Noah than it does in terms of the long age Lyellian geology that's become mainstream today.
Let's turn to genetics. I've seen that several, secular schools have done genetic studies on the genome. What do the studies of genetics teach us about this topic?
The study of genetics actually totally confirms the traditional reading of Genesis. On our website, we have an article by one of the leading plant geneticists in the entire world, Dr. John Sanford, which documents, proves beyond any reasonable doubt that the evidence from the Y chromosome of men from every people group on Earth and from mitochondrial DNA from women from every people group on Earth confirm that every human being on Earth is descended from one man and one woman who were created in a state of genetic perfection less than 10,000 years ago. And of course, the evolutionists, while most of them will acknowledge this, will say, well, but there was all this millions of years of evolution leading up to Y chromosome Adam and mitochondrial Eve. But as Dr. Sanford shows in that article and in his book, Genetic Entropy, which is available on our website, that's nonsense, because mutations do not add any new functional information to the genome of any plant, animal, or human being. Mutations destroy the architecture of the genome. And therefore, if there had been these mythical millions of years leading up to Y chromosome Adam and mitochondrial Eve, they would have been so genetically broken, degenerate, that they wouldn't even probably been able to have any viable offspring. So no, genetics confirms the literal historical truth of the sacred history of Genesis, just as all the fathers, doctors, popes, and council fathers taught in their authoritative teaching. What do you make of the Protestants that are doing this type of work too? Answers from Genesis, I think, is a YouTube channel, and lately they've been doing a lot of genetic type of studies. They've taken their own genetics and had them tested, and they link themselves back to one of the sons of Noah, Ham, Japheth, and Shem. What do you make of that resource? We should be grateful to our separated brethren for much of the work that they've done in the realm of the natural sciences. But of course, their theology is all wrong. What we need to do is restore the true Catholic doctrine of creation, which is the foundation of our faith, just as it's set forth in the Catechism of Trent, the most authoritative catechism in the history of the Catholic Church. And then we would be bringing all of these millions of separated brethren back into the one true church. So yes, we should be grateful for what they have done in the realm of the natural sciences to show that sound science confirms the literal historical truth of Genesis, just as all the fathers and doctors of the church believed and taught. But we should be bringing them back by proclaiming the whole truth of the Catholic faith from the first article of the Creed. That should be our priority.
Mr. Owen, we only have a couple minutes left in our conversation, but one of the common remarks that I hear whenever this topic is brought up is the reference to Humane Generis from Pius XII, saying that that Catholics should take seriously evolution as a hypothesis, and then further, John Paul II's his message to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences saying, quote, "Today, more than a half a century after the appearance of that encyclical, some new findings lead us towards a recognition of evolution as more than a hypothesis." What would your comment be in regards to that?
Very good questions. So first of all,
you got about a minute.
If you read Humane Generis, the Pope actually tells the bishops that they must teach that all of Genesis is true history, and that every word in the Bible is true, whether it's talking about natural science or geography or faith or morals or anything else. The only permission that the Pope gives in Humane Generis is for Catholic experts to examine the evidence for and against the evolutionary hypothesis. He doesn't give any permission whatsoever to believe or teach it. The problem is that most Catholic intellectuals have not obeyed Pope Pius XII, and that's why we founded the Kolbe Center, to obey him, to provide the forum for this examination to take place, because when the hypothesis is examined, it's exposed as a fraud. Now, if you look at every statement favorable to the evolutionary hypothesis by Pope St. John Paul II or any recent pope, you will find two things. Number one, every statement favorable to the evolutionary hypothesis was made of it as a hypothesis in natural science. When papal infallibility was defined at Vatican I, it was defined very precisely. It says, the Pope is not given this gift of infallibility to define any new doctrine, but only to define
I hate to do this to you, Mr. Owen, but we are out of time. We have to say goodbye now. Our show is coming to an end this first hour. Hugh Owen, Kolbe Center. Check him out online, foundationsrestored.com, foundationsrestored.com. Hugh Owen, God bless you. God love you. Have a great day. We'll see you in the next hour.